January 29th, 2025, 8:47 p.m., Washington, D.C. An American Airlines regional jet is on final approach to Ronald Reagan Washington National Airport. Flight 5342 left Wichita, Kansas 3 hours ago. 60 passengers, 2 pilots, 2 flight attendants. They're less than a minute from landing. Below them, the Potomac River is dark and cold. At the same time, a U.S. Army Black Hawk helicopter, call sign PAT-25, is flying south along the river. 3 crew members on board, conducting a routine night training flight with night vision goggles. The air traffic controller managing both aircraft is handling 11 planes and 5 helicopters simultaneously. He's been in the seat for over 5 hours. At 8:48 p.m., the 2 aircraft collide at an altitude of 278 feet, roughly the height of a 20-story building, just half a mile from the runway threshold. The jet's right wing strikes the helicopter. Both aircraft break apart instantly and plunge into the Potomac River. All 67 people on board both aircraft are killed. It is the deadliest commercial aviation disaster in the United States in more than 2 decades. Within hours, investigators will descend on the crash site. Within weeks, they'll discover something that will make this disaster not just a tragedy, but a scandal. Because this crash didn't come out of nowhere. The warnings were filed for a decade, and nobody listened. Ronald Reagan Washington National Airport sits on the west bank of the Potomac River in Arlington, Virginia, directly across the water from the U.S. Its capital, the White House, and the Pentagon. It is the closest major airport to the heart of American power. That proximity creates a problem. The restricted airspace over Washington, designed to protect government buildings from aerial threats, squeezes all incoming and outgoing air traffic into a narrow corridor over the Potomac River. Commercial jets, military helicopters, police helicopters, medevac flights, all of them funneled through the same tight space. As of 2023, Reagan National had the busiest single runway in the entire national airspace system. More operations per runway than O'Hare, more than LAX, more than Dallas-Fort Worth. It handles roughly 800 flights per day. And the helicopter traffic, military training flights from nearby bases, law enforcement patrols around government buildings, medical transports, cuts directly through the approach paths that commercial jets use to land. Pilots who fly in this airspace describe it as one of the most complex and dangerous in the country. For years, they raised concerns. So did air traffic controllers. So did other helicopter operators. Nobody with the authority to change things did anything about it. On the evening of January 29th, Flight 5342 departed Wichita, Kansas at 6:39 p.m. Eastern. It was a routine PSA Airlines flight operating under the American Airlines brand. A Bombardier CRJ-700, a smaller regional jet, 60 passengers. Among them were members of the U.S. figure skating community, athletes, coaches, and their families, returning from a training camp in Wichita. The flight was uneventful. 3 hours later, the crew made contact with Reagan Tower for their approach. Meanwhile, at 6:45 p.m., the Army Black Hawk, PAT-25, had taken off from Davison Army Airfield at Fort Belvoir, Virginia. The crew of 3 was conducting an annual evaluation flight using night vision goggles. This type of training flight happened regularly in the Washington area. The crew filed a visual flight rules plan, meaning they would navigate by sight, not instruments, along helicopter routes that cut through the Reagan approach corridor. Here's where the architecture of the disaster begins to form. At 8:43 p.m., Flight 5342 contacted Reagan Tower. The controller was working alone, managing both the helicopter traffic and the fixed-wing aircraft traffic. These are normally 2 separate positions. On this night, they were combined into one. He was handling 11 aircraft and 5 helicopters. The controller initially cleared Flight 5342 for a visual approach to runway 1. Then he changed his mind. He asked the crew if they could accept runway 33 instead, the secondary runway. They agreed. This was a critical decision. Runway 33's approach path cuts directly across helicopter, Route 4. The same route PAT-25 was flying along the Potomac River. At 8:46 p.m., the controller told the Black Hawk crew that traffic was coming. A CRJ at 1,200 feet, circling to runway 33. The helicopter crew responded, "PAT-25 has the traffic in sight." But did they? The NTSB investigation would later reveal that the helicopter crew may have been looking at a different aircraft entirely. The controller never warned the pilots of Flight 5342 about the helicopter. The 18 minutes before the collision, warning alarms began sounding in the background of the tower transmissions. 9 separate collision alerts in 18 minutes. The controller's radar showed both aircraft converging. At 8:48 p.m., the Black Hawk was at 278 feet, 78 feet higher than the 200-foot maximum altitude for that portion of the route. The CRJ-700 was descending through roughly the same altitude on its approach. The two aircraft merged on the radar screen. Then they disappeared. Among the 64 people on Flight 5342 were members of the U.S. figure skating community. Coaches, young athletes, and their parents were returning from a development camp in Wichita. The 3 soldiers on the Black Hawk were conducting a routine evaluation. They had families. They had served their country. In the days that followed, so the names and faces of those who died became public. 67 lives, each with their own story, their own plans, their own people waiting for them to come home. The youngest passenger was 9 years old. The investigation that followed would take nearly a year. The National Transportation Safety Board, the NTSB, deployed investigators immediately. They recovered the flight data recorder and cockpit voice recorder from both aircraft. What they found wasn't just a mechanical failure or a momentary lapse in judgment. It was something far worse. The NTSB uncovered that this collision was the predictable result of systemic failures that had been building for over a decade. In 2013, after a near miss between a helicopter and a commercial jet in the same airspace, recommendations were made to reroute helicopter traffic away from the approach pass. The FAA did not act on them. In 2018, the FAA downgraded the Reagan Control Tower from a Level 10 facility, its highest complexity rating, to a Level 9. This meant the tower could no longer attract or retain the most experienced controllers. The FAA could not provide documentation explaining why. In 2022, an internal FAA working group specifically urged moving helicopter traffic away from Reagan's approach corridors. Their recommendation was rejected. An FAA official later told investigators it was considered, and these are the actual words used, too political to save lives. Throughout this period, air traffic controllers at Reagan were filing safety reports. They compiled data, and they made formal recommendations through the proper channels. Former controller Emily Hanoka later described it this way: "The warning signs were obvious. The cracks in the system were visible, and frontline controllers were ringing the bell for years. Nobody with authority listened." Between 2021 and 2024, there were over 15,200 close proximity incidents between helicopters and commercial aircraft near Reagan. 85 of those were classified as near collisions. At least one collision avoidance alarm was triggered per month since 2011. And on January 28th, the day before the crash, there were 2 separate near misses between Army helicopters and commercial jets. Collision alarms sounded in the cockpits of passenger aircraft, twice in one day. 24 hours later, 67 people were dead. When the NTSB held its final hearing in January 2026, board members did not hide their frustration. Chair Jennifer Homendy said she could not believe the FAA had never realized there were only 75 feet, at best, of vertical separation between a helicopter on Route 4 and a plane landing on runway 33. 75 feet, the wingspan of the jet that crashed. Board member Todd Inman asked whether the FAA would still be ignoring data 5 years from now, whether anyone was really listening. The NTSB determined the crash was, in their words, 100% preventable. The Justice Department admitted government liability. The FAA had failed. The Reagan crash exposes something bigger than a single failure at a single airport. Air traffic control in the United States is understaffed. The FAA has been dealing with a nationwide controller shortage for years. At Reagan, Nearly a third of controller positions were unfilled a year after the crash. The controllers who were there were overworked. The system that was supposed to protect them and the passengers above them wasn't designed for the volume and complexity of traffic it was handling. And the safety mechanisms that should have caught the problem were buried under bureaucracy. Controllers filed reports. Working groups made recommendations. Data showed thousands of close calls, but the FAA's own internal structure, where safety recommendations get filtered through layers of management, where concerns from frontline workers are weighed against political and operational considerations, ensured that nothing changed until 67 people died in the Potomac River on a cold January night. The helicopter's ADS-B tracking system, the technology that broadcasts an aircraft's position to everyone nearby, was turned off during the flight. This was common practice for military training flights in the area. If it had been on, the commercial jet's collision avoidance system would have detected the helicopter 59 seconds before impact, nearly a full minute to react. For the helicopter crew, they had 48 seconds. But from their cockpit voice recorder, it's clear. They never saw the jet. They never knew it was there. After the crash, the FAA acted. They restricted helicopter traffic near Reagan. They eliminated mixed helicopter and fixed-wing operations. They began reviewing other airports with similar configurations. Every single change the FAA made after the crash was something that had been recommended before the crash. This is what an ignored warning looks like when it finally comes true. Not a villain twirling a mustache, not a single person asleep at the switch, but a system, layers of bureaucracy, chronic understaffing, competing priorities, and the slow erosion of safety culture that allowed a known danger to persist until the statistics caught up with reality. 15,000 close calls is not a number. It's a countdown. 85 near collisions is not a statistic. It's a warning siren that was sounding for years and was treated as background noise. The people who filed those reports, the controllers, were the pilots, the safety officers. They did their jobs. They identified the risk. They documented it. They followed the process, and the process failed them. Every investigation like this ends with recommendations. Reports get filed, policies get changed, officials express their commitment to making things safer. But the question that matters, the one that NTSB board member Todd Inman asked during the hearing, is the question this channel exists to ask. Are we going to sit here 5 years from now after the next disaster and realize the data was already there? That someone filed the report, that someone raised the alarm, and that nobody listened? Because the pattern is always the same. The warnings come first, the tragedy comes second, the reforms come third. And the only variable is how many people have to die before step 3 happens. If this video made you think about how systems fail the people they're supposed to protect, subscribe. Every video on this channel asks the same question: who knew? What did they do about it? And what happened next? I'll see you in the next one.